Moira has been involved in UFO research for well over 30 years, I've been told to say, and well over 30 years, and a real gatekeeper of really Australian information. And I know that she's published it in her 3 books, which she's brought here tonight. The latest one is Alien Gene, and I'm keen to see what she's got to say about that. And I'll just tell you a bit about Moira. I do know for a fact that she's an animal welfare supporter, and that she has was it the founder, the senior vice president and co-founder of Hearts for Animals, which she is still running.
Oh yes.
But Moira, probably like many of you, has always looked at the stars and wondered, you know, what's out there. Who's had that experience? Lots of people? Yeah. Have you had it from an early age?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, most people do. Interesting, isn't it? But anyway, so as a result, Moira has become one of Australia's enduring UFO researchers, and the history of UFO research, of Australian UFO research, she knows it, and she's got such a good memory with it. You have to write a book just about the history some stage. Anyway, so over the decades she's collected many UFO reports, which she's published in the 3 books that she's got here tonight. The Gosford Files, Contact Downunder, which is a Century of UFO Sightings in Australasia and the Western Pacific, and the latest one, Alien Gene. Now, Moira also has been, in the past, she's been the founder and, still the founder and coordinator of INUFOR, which is the International
Independent
Network of UFO Researchers. Also, she has been a field investigator for MUFON and the State Director for New South Wales for 18 years. And she's also co-founder and life member of the Sydney group UFO Research New South Wales. So I'm very pleased to introduce her to you tonight, and do pick her brains in question and answer time.
Oh, thanks.
She'll have wonderful answers for you. So please welcome Moira McGhee.
Thank you very much, everyone, for having me here. It's a privilege to come. What happened at Gosford? We were contacted by Sergeant Wenning of the police force, my colleague Bryan Dickeson and myself, and we were asked to go up, and the newspaper editor asked us to go up to investigate. So we put a bit in the paper and said we'd be at the sailing club one Saturday afternoon. Now we were expecting maybe perhaps a dozen people. Instead of that, the whole sailing club was flooded with people. Witnesses from that night of the 30th of December 1995, but also a lot of other witnesses who'd seen things in the past. They were a little bit too scared to ever come out and say to somebody, guess what I saw, for fear that they might be thought a little bit loopy. But they realised this was the time to come forward and say what had happened to them. Now, the actual result of that was this book, The Gosford Files, which my colleague and I wrote as a result of the sightings that night, but also a lot of other accounts from people on the central coast of New South Wales. It is interesting that I was told that down in the Broadwater, because of the mountains around the central coast, it was actually impervious to radar. Radar could not pick up what was actually down over the Broadwater. Now it was then later on, after we wrote the book, more people came forward, and I was left with some very interesting accounts. Now, the one lady, she was a grandmother, and she told me about her 25-year-old grandson, and he was still traumatised. At that stage, they didn't know about the sightings that other people were hearing and seeing. So what happened was, in the early evening, she sent her grandson up to the shops to buy a carton of beer and some groceries for a New Year's Eve party the next night. But he didn't come back. They started to get really, really worried. And several hours later, there was a knock on the door, and the police were there with a very disorientated and dazed young man. The police said they'd found him lying in the park, supposedly unconscious, after they'd received calls from passers-by that said, guess what, there's a dead body in the park. Now they checked, he hadn't been drinking, the carton of beer was unopened, and his wallet was still intact. So he came home and he tried to tell his mother something, and she just laughed at him. And he said, "Granny," he said, "I was walking back through the park and these little beings jumped out of the bushes and grabbed me. And I don't remember anything else until I woke up with the police getting me back to my feet." So he said, "Mum doesn't believe me." So that was all right. They all went to bed, not knowing about the sightings all over the area that night. And at about 5 in the morning, she and her daughter, the boy's mother, started to hear this really loud humming, throbbing noise. The whole house vibrated. They went outside and they looked, and there was nothing to see. So the next morning, his mother, who was a disbeliever, suddenly said to the grandmother, "You've got a wasp nest in the house, we're going," and very promptly packed up and left. But this poor bloke, I mean, he was still very traumatised. He doesn't remember what happened. We don't always get the chance to give people hypnosis. We don't always do that unless there's good reason and the person's willing. But then what I would like to see you is some parts of the Central Coast.
Point it toward the laptop.
Yeah, that was from the newspaper at the time, and it was thanks to the newspaper editor that we're able to contact all these people. So that's the Central Coast area, and you can see there's Sydney and there's the different lakes going up there. That is a view over the Broadwater, when you can see the mountains up on the side, which do preclude being spotted sometimes by radar and things like that. That's one of the witnesses' drawings of the UFO that they saw, but some said it wasn't sucking up water. Some of the people said no, it was very, very bright beams of light penetrating the water, but they were penetrating it almost like they were solid rather than they were just a light. And we have had a lot of other UFO reports where they talk about the solid beam of light. Now, how that equates with our science or what we might discuss in the future, I don't know. But there is a lot of research going into what they call solid beams of light, which they think might be something to do with quantum physics or teleportation, all kinds of things, and I don't know the answers to that. That was another one. That was a lady who said it looked more like a carousel wheel. She actually saw it on the 15th of January, that particular one. Then we're looking at the Skillion. Now, the Skillion and Crackneck are both rocky coastal headlands. Does anyone here know much about the Central Coast area? Well, similar to the Gold Coast and up the Queensland coast, you've got these rocky headlands. But it's commonly believed by a lot of the residents, especially the old-timers, that there is a ley line. If people know what a ley line is, an energy earth grid line going up the coast, touching on those headlands. And one lady spoke to me, and there's more pictures there. She told me that in 1932, when she was very young, she and her fiance and their family every Sunday used to go out in the horse and cart and go to the Skillion for a picnic. And she said she and her future mother-in-law would make the picnic lunch and pack up while the blokes went down fishing on the rocks. And this one particular day, she had helped the mother-in-law. She put on her swimmers and she saw what she thought was a path going down the rocks. So she ran down to the beach, and it was only later she realised there was no path there. It was actually great big rocks with gaps. By rights, she should have actually probably broken a leg at least. And that then led us to believe a lot of people's reports that there's almost like another dimension there, something to do with maybe the ley line. But it's really interesting because in 1997, a fellow told me how he noticed there was this dark cloud over the Skillion, and he drove up. and this dark cloud was by itself in the sky, and there was lightning coming out of it, but the lightning wasn't hitting the ground. The lightning was sort of going in and out and around this single solitary dark cloud. And then he noticed that there was actually a couple of small planes flying around it. He said, but what was really interesting was that there was about 100 people with their cars parked, all standing on the headland staring at this cloud. And he said it was really strange because you'd think people would talk, or they'd say, get a load of that, what do you think? He said there was dead silence with all these people just staring. After a half an hour, he left and went back home. So he never knows the full result. Also, I have one witness who was telling me she was out there actually canoodling with her boyfriend, and she suddenly felt vibrations on the rail at the side of the cliffs. She thought it was coming from underneath, and then she felt a breeze on her head, and the next thing is they looked up and they could hear this whirring engine type sound, and they looked up to see a large grey see-through shape above, almost like what we might call interdimensional. It was see-through, and she said then there was a sudden large clang and it went up and away very fast. So this is one of the pictures taken at the Skilling. There is one of the UFOs that was photographed the one time, and that is it close up. That's the best we can do. What was it? I don't know, but it certainly wasn't anything conventional. It's not so easy to get photographs at times. People mean to, but they're so engrossed with staring at whatever that is, they forget to take a photo. But now the next one was very interesting. Another fellow came forward after we'd written the book, and his name was Carl Roberts. And on the 25th of October 1997, and he'd gone down to the water's edge at about 2 in the morning just to clear his head. And all of a sudden, he saw this light in the water. It was under the water. And he said it was going round and round, and there was a spray like a lit up fountain coming out from it. So he said that he watched it for about 20 minutes, and he said that he wished he had somebody there to say, look at this, look, what is this? Now, this is how he described the object. And what he said was, it was this little object, very, very bright, suddenly came out of the water, and it shot up about 2 foot above the river, and it was circling. And it actually had an electrical buzz, and it was circling round and round and round, going higher and higher. When it was about 30 metres above the water, he suddenly looked up and realised there was a huge solid metal global sort of hull above it. There was one, what he called an enormous mothership, up there in the sky, but it wasn't lit up. He could see the light from this little object lighting it up. And that's another, being a cartoonist, he did some wonderful diagrams for me. At the time he came to see me, it was at a seminar, and he had long hippie hair and a long beard. He was still traumatised. He just was gibbering about this sighting, gibbering about what he'd seen and talking about it. He said the global hull above, the outer rim was revolving, and he could feel this force, this field force around it. It was affecting him. He said eventually the little light went up into the centre. Everything went black because that was the only lit object, and then the big one just went away with one enormous whoosh into the air. And that's his description, his drawing of the bigger object and the size of it. So we were still getting reports after we wrote the book, the Gosford Files. Then people were coming forward with more things. Most of these, I believe, were really genuine. They were scared of being ridiculed, so they felt it was safe to come forward and say something about what they'd seen. But Paul Carl was so traumatised by what he'd seen, and that he hadn't had anyone around to witness it with him. But I do truly believe that's what it was. I don't know if the poor guy will ever get over it. Maybe he's writing alien comics now, I don't know. That was just another one from Barara Waters, which had some similarities. That was from 1984. Now, Then I go to a place called Kalnura, which is in the hills west of Gosford. It's southeast of Mount Yengo. Now, Mount Yengo is held in absolute awe by the Aboriginals. They believe that could even be the apex of what could be like a mini Bermuda Triangle or something like that. And the strange thing is, I was talking to a gentleman the other day, and one of his, I think it was his grandfather, owned it, and the government mandatorily bought it off him, and it's been closed off. Anyway, what happened, this lady in 1997, Vicky, she came to me to tell me with her husband, she lived in a valley down in round the Kalnura way. It's below her property was a so-called horse stud. Now, she said there was very strange things going on there. A few very well-known people used to visit on the weekends. She said horse riding my foot. She said there was goats' heads on the wall and all kinds of rather unsavoury things. So what happened was, one Saturday night, her kids came home. They came home from going out and they turned Rage on the TV. So to get a bit of peace, she went out on the veranda to have a cigarette and get away from the noise. And all of a sudden, this huge golden ball came over the ridge of the hill. And when it came over the ridge of the hill, it split into three. And the main part was a large white oval object which is spinning clockwise, but it had a red-orange core that was spinning anti-clockwise, which knocks out any idea of maybe a meteorite or something like that. Anyway, what happened was it was stuck in one of the trees and it eventually crashed down into the steep valley below. Now, we didn't go, but after that, I should go back to this. After that, she noticed there was this absolutely white, cloudy mist which was going straight up into the air. So she walked up there after a day or so. She took the dogs for a walk, who loved walking. They would not go anywhere near that mist. But she walked through it and said she came out to daylight on the other side. And I went up with a colleague, Glenn Land, who helped me with a lot of research. And we got up there and I started doing some investigation. So I always carry a Geiger counter with me, and I was really surprised. I would have expected to find the area where this craft had come down would have a higher radiation level than the control area outside, but it wasn't. Actually, the area where that had gone down had far less radiation. I thought, this is strange. So I got Vicky's husband and my colleague. I said to the guys, I get height sick. I said, you climb down there and tell me what's down there, what's crashed down there. So they go down, and about 5 minutes later, they both come scrambling up the bank. And I said, well, what happened? What did you find? They said, there was a great big python snake in the tree. We aren't going any further. So I was too scared to get down there anyway. It was very steep and rugged. It was a very narrow, deep valley. So I still don't know to this day exactly what crashed in there, but something crashed. And Vicky said to me at the time, she said, was it a UFO or something from outer space? She said, or did those people in that horse stud below us manifest it? Were they practicing some kind of, black or alternative magic that actually manifested that thing? So that was okay. Then something happened that really rocked me. Because, as you can see though, before I go on to that, this is where the tree branches were broken, and you can see the trees they're not really burnt, they're just totally drained of sap. It was just like they'd been sort of put into a hot oven or something and dried right out. So yes, and that's part of where the area it obviously went down. Now, there was a very sad ending to this, and I don't know if there was a connection or not. Vicky was only in her early 40s. Her kids were just late teens, early 20s. She had lived in New Guinea in the past, and I'm not sure what her parents were doing there, some kind of mission work or government work. And she said they used to see a lot of UFOs in Papua New Guinea. And she said every time they came over, all the natives would rush up the hill to the mission to hide. They were scared of them, so she'd had experiences before. Anyway, about less than 12 months later, I was contacted by Vicky's husband. They were driving home one night at about 9 o'clock on a Saturday night. She just keeled over in the front seat and she was dead three hours later. Did it have a connection? I honestly don't know. When I do research, I don't like to make conclusions without proof. But it was very sad that suddenly she was just gone, dead. I thought, was it something to do with that white cloud she'd walked through? And yet the radiation was less than outside. I honestly just don't know. There was other rather sad things in a week after Carl's sighting over Brooklyn of the cartoonist sighting. On Friday the 31st of October, a brilliant egg-shaped object with a blue illuminated front and a large right rear section was seen over the lakes. You've got Lake Munmora and Budgewoi Lake and the different lakes going down the central coast. A few people reported that. On Saturday the 1st of November, there was 2 expert sailors out fishing. They had a 5-metre half cabin boat. They were on Budgewoi Lake, and they had a radio, they had flares, they had life jackets, they were well equipped. At about 5 p.m. they made a routine radio call, and at about 11 to 11:30 that night, a family at Windermere Park saw, they said, 6 unusual lights over the lake. Just after midnight, the police were called to the lakefront and they said that there was a man screaming for help, but they couldn't see anything. On Sunday the 2nd, in the morning of the Sunday, they found the boat intact, empty and drifting. Nothing had been seen and heard. The fuel tank was full. No problems with the motor. The bodies were later found floating in the lake. They had not used their radio or life jackets. And although it was put down as assumed drowned, very little was said about the circumstances, with the UFOs being seen by more than one witness over the area. It reminds me a little bit maybe of the Bermuda Triangle, where suddenly the people are gone. The bodies were found. They didn't even say how they ended up in the lake, what caused it, nothing. And these were people that should not have just drowned without any other symptoms. So this was really, really strange. Now, also we had, what people know about the Barrington area that runs sort of from Newcastle up to the Gloucester area, Barrington Tops. Barrington Tops is another area with very, very unusual energies. A lot of pilots won't fly over it. It says that all of a sudden all their equipment and their radar and their electronics go bananas. They do not like to fly over there, and there's been a lot of small planes gone missing without a trace. It's got mist, it's got bad terrain, there's a spate of sightings over there as well. And it's oh dear, it's a highly unusual area. In August 2001, by the way, I use pseudonyms for all my witnesses mostly. A lady called Mary Luck, she had gone down to the school bus. The driver was outside the bus, the kids were outside the bus, and they were all watching this silver craft in the sky, a UFO. The whole bus full of kids, driver, everybody. And then later on that night, a gentleman called Trevor Perry, he was out feeding his dogs, and there was a huge craft hovering above his property. It was 40 to 50 metre light shining down on the ground. He was pretty scared. It moved across the paddock, then took off at incredible speed. But he said, what was it? He didn't think possibly that was anything of ours, of those dimensions or this huge light. And then I got contacted by a fellow I will call Jimmy Martin. Jimmy Martin lived in the Cranback area of Barrington Tops. This was 1966 to 7. What his job was, we have, which you've probably got in Queensland, people we call Pitt Street farmers. They're bankers and lawyers that in the city trying to do a bit of tax evasion or avoidance, and they'd buy these country properties. And Jimmy's job was minding one of these properties. All he had to live in was a shed and a caravan, but he was quite happy with that. And then he started to see strange objects and strange lights in the sky. I'll show you a bit more of this. That is one of the objects he photographed during the day, just in the distance. This is how sort of remote and rural this area is. As you can see, I've got the best of the photos I can. He called those Tipperary Mountains, and quite a lot of the UFOs came from there. Now, what happened was, he saw these strange objects and lights in the sky, and then one night he woke up shaking. And he went outside, and he said that he went into wasn't dreaming, because he actually went outside. He suddenly was in a golden light, and he was floating in the air above the shed. And then he said, this voice said to him, if you go up, you will never come back. So he decided he didn't want to go up after all, and came back. But then Jimmy started having unusual dreams and premonitions. The animals got spooked. The dog used to run away and hide, and one day never came back at all. There was mutilations of cattle in nearby properties. It was all getting very nasty and scary. He also noticed that there was unusual RAAF and military activities going on. So I'd spoken to other people from Barrington Tops. They even talked about sightings of a yowie-type creature there. At one stage, it actually threw rocks at the kids. So I'm thinking, I've got an awful lot of witnesses, and they're country people who don't like to say anything. We've got some very strange things going on. But unfortunately, and with the Bigfoots, the One Shire Council engineer had 2 attacks on his huge aviaries, which would take 2 to 3 men to move. And what was happening, they'd been moved 2 foot by something that was hellishly strong. So poor Jimmy got a little bit carried away. Jimmy started to drink, and he sat up every night with his camera on a very wobbly tripod, and he took picture after picture after picture after picture. He ended up presenting me with 650 photographs. And I thought, oh dear. But he kept a very comprehensive diary. And this diary stated the time and the direction and everything else. That was fine. So anyway, I'm thinking, now I'll start to show you some of the photos that Jimmy took. Now, some are due to the wobbling of his tripod and the fact that he left the time device on a little bit too long, so there was just a bit too much timing to them. But these are the different photos that Jimmy took. So something was going on there, definitely. These were all very, very interesting photographs. So I'd got his diary, and I'd got all the dates and the times. That one in particular is fascinating. So I thought I like to do proper research. My colleague Glenn and I decided, he did most of my photo analysis. We were still a little bit perplexed. We thought some stuff is definitely unusual, but other is definitely the fault of the way he's taken the photographs, being rather pissed and having a wobbly tripod and leaving his time device on a little bit too long. We travelled all the way to Canberra to a colleague of mine that is a full-time astronomer. She teaches astronomy, and she looked at these photos and she got her boss. And the boss came down, who was head of the observatory. He said, what's most interesting about these photos? A lot of them are of astronomical bodies. He said, but you cannot take a picture of those particular planets or systems from the face of this Earth. The only place you can take those photographs from is Hubble telescope. So that was becoming even more intriguing. So I went back to Jimmy and I said, look, Jimmy, the astronomers would like to talk to you. These photographs are very interesting. How you are able the actual area could be interesting in itself, that you're getting photographs you shouldn't be able to take from the face of this earth. But Jimmy had a friend. Jimmy's friend was determined no one was going to take advantage of Jimmy. His photos were worth a lot of money. And I thought, oh dear, here we go. And then he suggested we started altering the times and the dates on the diary of the photographs. I said, we can't do that. But it got to the stage Jimmy was becoming so disturbed by everything, his family made him go back home, and I decided now might be the time just to let the whole thing drop. Because Jimmy was obviously just getting too traumatised by the whole thing, and I knew something had happened to him. But like a lot of cases, you do the best you can, but the most important thing is the well-being of the witness. You know, I mean, some researchers don't give a stuff. They'll just turn around and plug the witness for any information they can get. But I think there comes a time when you've got to say, I've just got to let this one go, no matter how interesting it is. The astronomers were absolutely fascinated as how Jimmy could on Earth get all these photographs. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Wilcannia out the west of New South Wales. Wilcannia itself is quite interesting because cross-country, you've got Wilcannia here and then the border, and you go over close to Woomera after a while. Now, I don't deny that some sightings people have had could be our own prototypes. I'm quite sure there are areas in Australia where they're experimenting with their newfangled craft that they've just developed and don't want anyone else to see. But it was quite interesting because in 1950s there was quite a lot of sightings, and there was an enormous effort to try and cover these up. I've written about this in the next book, Contact Downunder, about these ones. So here we go. What happened was in 1940s there was quite a few reports of traditional flying saucers, and one lady came forward she had reported one, and she had the letter from the RAAF telling her not to tell anybody about what she'd seen. This was in the 1940s. Now in 1953, John and Kevin were driving into Wilcannia in an open Jeep when a 20-foot saucer started hovering overhead. They stopped, they jumped out, and they madly started taking photographs. And then it shot out of sight in about 3 seconds. And they had this really clear image on the film. So they wrote to the army, who didn't take much notice. So then the silly buggers went and wrote to the Air Force. So 2 Air Force officers promptly came down and confiscated all their film. Took the lot, which they were not very happy about. A Broken Hill resident had seen a similar object, and he drew some sketches, and Kevin and John confirmed that that was the same item that they had seen. But then what happened in 1956, another couple saw a similar object near Wilcannia, and they took photos as well. And along came the Air Force and confiscated all the negatives and prints. But they'd heard about Kevin and John and what had happened there, so they had a second roll of film. They didn't tell the Air Force about their second roll of film. They hid it, and then they gave it to the Broken Hill newspaper 10 years later. In 1954, there was a Mr. Weston, and he was in a station northwest of Wilcannia, and he took a photograph of a large flying saucer. It was 80 metres in diameter. Now we're talking about something that's too big for our own prototypes. Once you get that big, they're not ours, not then. It was 500 foot above his wool shed. It left making loud clanking noises and an explosive sound. And he took the photos, and the Department of Civil Aviation started an investigation. Now, somebody had scared him off, because the next thing is not Mr. Weston, but his wife rang up the Civil Aviation. She sounded scared and claimed, please don't do anything more about this. This was just a hoax. Now, I can't see how you could hoax so much in those days with your photographs. Anyway, later, what was located by one of the investigators, the Department of Civil Aviation head office had an internal memo, and that was 2 weeks after she told them it was a hoax. And the memo said the American service source wants copies. The Americans wanted copies of these photos. Now, why would they if it was a hoax? We also have a case in 1959 at 8:30 on the Cobb Highway, which goes from Ivanhoe to Wilcannia, out west. Eddie was driving along, and all of a sudden, on the ground, at the right-hand side of the road, he saw this object. It was 30 foot long, 20 foot diameter, sitting on 2 short legs. It was silver, and it had 4 brightly lit portholes. It followed alongside his vehicle, and he couldn't get his vehicle to accelerate. Now, this is a normal thing with some of these encounters on the road. All of a sudden, the engine won't accelerate. It's like it's taking control of the car. After a while, it sped off into the horizon. So poor Eddie staggered home and told the family, guess what happened to me? They all told him, shut up about it. Don't talk about it. They'll make fun of us. You're not to say anything. It took him half a lifetime before he had the courage to come forward and tell us about what had happened all those years ago, when the family had told him he better be quiet or else. And guess who else also had contact with flying saucers out at Broken Hill? Pro Hart, the artist. And in 1968, he saw 5 dish-shaped objects fly over a dry creek bed in Wilcannia. His mate took some photographs. The Air Force confiscated them. Again, they took his photos, which makes me wonder, were they partly prototypes? Why were they so interested in taking all the photographs away? They said it was for security reasons. Anyway, what happened? Pro Hart painted a picture of his sightings and objects. He thought, right, you've taken the photographs, I'll paint a picture. And actually it was hanging in one of the council areas in Broken Hill for a long time, but it was attracting so much interest, they moved it over to a private gallery. Pro Hart's. And then Pro Hart also said that he'd had previous sightings when he was in the army in Broken Hill, that he had sightings of UFOs. And he said he thought that they were our own prototypes as well, but he said, oh, they followed a lot of people, and he said to the journalists that the UFOs seemed to favour his sister and kept following her car. So there's a lot of people who don't come out till much later to tell you things that have happened. Right, so now we will go to Tregear in, there we go, Tregear in Western Sydney and Tom Price in Western Australia. Now, there has been some very unusual fireball type sightings seen in these places. So what do you think of that? We're not 100% sure what it is, but these fiery red balls, now sometimes you get pranks and they're fakes. These are not the pranks and not the fake. We've had a lot of it analysed. They were seen in Western Sydney in late 94, May and July. Now, several witnesses took photos of these objects. One of them happened to be an ex-Department of Civil Aviation inspector for 31 years, and he said there is no way that they're anything of ours. I mean, it's good when you can get an expert who can, you know, who's expert in civil aviation or the military to give you an opinion. But what happened was over in Tom Price in West Australia, they were having their Sunday night barbecue, and the witness assured me the beer had not yet arrived. They had not been drinking. And all of a sudden, it's a very isolated community, and all of a sudden, this object came over at a slow speed. It was a controlled and steady flight. It came from the hills to the west and was going to the east. It was silent at treetop level, and they watched it for about 5 minutes. And it went from one range of hills over to the other. Everyone was gawking. Even the police were outside the police station gawking at it, with quite a few residents taking photographs. And it seemed to have a black square or rectangular core. It looked white from a distance, and as it disappeared over the hills, a second one came, following exactly the same path. So they were getting their videos and their photographs and everything else they could. When they sent their photos up for developing, many returned blank. And because of defamation, I will not mention the well-known photographic studio that are very well known for losing or obliterating UFO photos. It happens all the time. But anyway, what happened was, because some of it was on video, they didn't need developing, they already had it. So the next day, a whole lot of investigators that when people thought about it, didn't know who they were or where they came from, came up and interviewed a hell of a lot of the witnesses, except they didn't interview them in the town, they interviewed them outside of the town on the quiet, which had people rather puzzled. And the one witness who we got this video footage from, and there's another close-up, the people at Tregear in Western Sydney also confirmed that's exactly what they saw as well. And there was, at one time, little white lights actually around the outside of some of these objects. Also, I got a footage of film from Essex in Britain of exactly the same thing. Now, if it was one of our own experiments, they wouldn't be flying it over a major town in Britain, that's for sure. And these all appeared round about the same time in 1994. So that was all right. Fred, our one witness that had the video, the local TV station were putting, oh yes, great, we're going to have this as our leading news story. Perth TV said exactly the same thing. They flew Fred to Perth, and when he got to Perth, they said, oh, the story's been pulled. Here's your video back, we'll fly you back home. So why was this again suddenly covered up? I don't know. We're just lucky that Fred took his videos and we're able to at least show what this object looked like. And it's sort of got concentric wings. In Contact Downunder, I've given the explanation of the experts that analysed it for us, because I don't want to give a talk where I'm boring you with all kinds of technical stuff. But it is fascinating that. Again, we were very lucky to get a lot of really good footage of this object. What is it? I don't know, but they seem to think that there was something solid underneath it, but that was masking the actual shape of it. So again, that is the front cover of our book, Contact Downunder. We've actually put that on the front cover. That video. It is not very often a researcher is lucky enough to get video that can be analysed of such good quality. Then Bryan Dickeson, by the way, another witness that Mika Farah also saw it. But round about the same time, my colleague Bryan Dickeson got a telephone call from this lady, Sheila. And this was quite interesting. Her boy, in the country, they have friendly footy games, sometimes a couple of 100 miles apart. So they all go down to the other town, they play footy, then they all get drunk in the pub before they come back home. So she said they were actually returning from one of these games and they were heading back north again in the bus, light afternoon. She said suddenly they saw two orange balls heading towards them. And they were huge. She said these balls of light were several stories high. And what happened, it landed in a paddock straight ahead of the bus. She said the footy players, these big, brave, drunken footy players, were all screaming to the driver, help, get us out of here. They were all terrified. Nobody remembers anything else. The next thing they remember, the objects were gone, the bus is going down the road, and everybody's dead silent. Now, I've seen this case in other abduction cases where afterwards, if their memory's been erased, they're just dead silent. She said there was dead silent the whole way back. She said everyone got off the bus, and not one of those football players, including her boyfriend, would ever talk about it or say anything. Now, when I'm doing research, I don't like to import any imaginations or information into it. It is what it is and what the witnesses told me. But I had quite a giggle. I thought, if those aliens abducted a whole busload of drunken football players, they would really have their little hands full. And also, I'll go into Woomera and Mundrabilla, which are very close along. They're very close along the West Australia, and there's Norsemen. Now, I think most people have heard of the Mundrabilla sighting, haven't they? Where the car was lifted off the road? Yeah, that is in Contact Downunder. I have put the best of Australian sightings in. And people said, oh, they were imagining it. There was a great deal of trouble gone to try and cover that sighting up. But I've got a lot of information where some of it was sent to the States and everything. It is in Contact Downunder. But I had a case of a gentleman in 1998. I called him Jack Ulster out in Coonabarabran. He was driving home down the road at about 8 o'clock at night. And all of a sudden, he saw this white light, and he stopped his truck. He got out, and 9 foot above his truck was this black saucer-shaped object. It had a dark underside. It was about 9 foot overhead. It was about, underneath it, there was about a 6 foot diameter white light shining down on him. And he was quite fascinated. And I know this man personally. He's one of those old-fashioned no-nonsense farmers. You know, he doesn't make things up. And he said he stretched up like this, and he tried to touch it, but he couldn't, and it moved back. So he gets back into his truck, and the next thing is the white light is surrounding his truck. And he said, I looked out the window, he said, and all I could see were the treetops. And he was carried along in the air. He said it then gently set him down on the road and departed. He went home, he thought his wife would never believe him. What he didn't know is his neighbour had been driving the opposite way down the road. And the neighbour had been driving down the road, and he said, I saw this white light, and Jack's truck was hanging from it. He went home and told his wife, and she just inferred that he must have been drunk. That was rather unfortunate in that particular case, that another researcher, and I'd given Jack a pseudonym and everything, this other researcher who just couldn't help himself went out to Coonabarabran and tried to find out who'd sold their property and moved to the Central Coast. So Jack was very, very unhappy later on that people had been talking about it. That you really shouldn't do that. There was another funny one in Norseman. This was rather hilarious as well, actually. Norseman in southwest Australia. It was in about mid-1976, and 28-year-old Barry was a truck driver going to Esperance. But what happened was his truck broke down, and he had to leave it in the garage at Norseman. He had friends in the caravan park that he went and stayed with, and he said, we went to the Saturday night drive-in, which was like outside, and very primitive. He said, we all watched Blazing Saddles. He said that was what was on at the time. And he said it was a hot night, so he offered to take the teenagers from the caravan park out to a local swimming hole. And he said, we got there, and he said, it was the days of love, sex, rock and roll. He said, we all went skinny dipping. There was about 3 carloads of them with Barry in charge. And he said, they're all in this local dam at the roadside, about 2 o'clock in the morning. He said, and suddenly the top of the trees started dipping, and they were all lit up. But he said, thought, that's funny, there's no breeze. The trees are bending over and they're all lit up. And the next thing, about 30 foot above the ground, a 40-foot diameter white light came over and illuminated the whole area. He said there was total panic. He said everyone's racing for the cars. Some didn't even grab their clothes. They all took off in sheer fright. And he said, we're halfway down the highway and we suddenly realised we were all naked and dripping wet. And he said, what the hell am I going to tell their parents? They're teenagers dripping wet and naked. He was lucky because there had been other sightings reported on the local radio, a bit of a blackout, and the friends in the caravan park had seen the UFOs from a distance. And I said, "Oh, what did you learn out of that?" He said, "Next time I take my swimming trunks with me." This is video of the carry-on glyphs, which are up in the escarpment to the west of Gosford and Woy Woy. In Gosford Files I talk about them, and at that stage I accepted the official explanation that these glyphs that you're seeing up on the screen were fake. I have changed my mind totally and completely. There was a great deal of government effort to say the glyphs were fake, because they do not want anyone saying the Egyptians got here before the British did. It could cause a lot of political problems. But anyway, what happened was, with the glyphs, they're in a sheltered rock face. It's 15 foot high, 5 foot apart, 30 foot long, and it's got a lot of earth energies and magnetic deviations there. The Aboriginals have told me that they consider it somebody else's sacred place, and the glyphs have been there for as long as they can remember. So the stories about university students carving them, I spoke to one of the uni students. They never carved them. They merely cleaned them out, which unfortunately has stopped some of the carbon dating and that, because they cleaned all the lichen and everything out of these glyphs so they could study them. There's over 100 individual carvings, and they appeared to be 3rd, 4th dynasty Egyptian, dating back 2700 to 2750 BC. I certainly grabbed all the books on hieroglyphs I could and madly started translating. So did quite a few other colleagues. We all came up with a slightly different translation. So I don't know the truth of where these glyphs actually originated from or who did them, except that they're very, very old. In 1930, Eric Worrell, the snake man, was shown these glyphs by an old man who claimed that he'd actually found them in 1911. There's ruins of an old house at the side. I found the gentleman who used to live in it, and he said there are other carvings around that appear to be Egyptian or Phoenician as well. He only found them by accident because he had a small puppy that used to keep going missing. He'd have to go looking for it. And he did tell me about one story. When he was living in this house below the glyphs, he had to get up very early for work in the morning, and he's sitting on the outdoor loo at about 5 o'clock in the morning. His wife's in the kitchen cooking breakfast, and this huge big white light came down between the house and the dunny. And he sat there absolutely frozen in terror. His wife wasn't going to go out until this went away. And the other thing is, there was another lady that lived down below this escarpment that had a similar experience when she was also in the little outhouse, and suddenly the dog was screaming to get in and jumped into the loo with her. There was another white light over there. So I thought, well, whoever's up there is having fun terrorising people when they're out in the privy. But the thing was, I believed what I was told, that they were a fake. I do not believe that anymore. So in the Gosford Files, I've suggested that perhaps the authorities were right. In Contact Downunder, I've said no way. What happened was, as I said, the Aboriginal aunties told me that they believed it was somebody else's sacred spot. There's a lot of earth energies there which have been used for good or bad. We have found sometimes satanic rites have been performed there as well. One of my witnesses who had contact, she's in Alien Gene, she and her boyfriend used to go up there and play music. And I've said quite often that alien contact has a lot to do with frequency, vibration, music. It all plays a part sometimes in the contact. Now, there was a gentleman who was an Egyptologist called Ray Johnson. He went to the Department of Antiquities in Egypt, and they begged him not to let the government destroy these glyphs. And when the government's saying, oh, they're fake, one of my members went overseas. She also went to the Museum of Antiquities in Cairo and also the British Museum. And it surprised her to know that both of those experts knew about these glyphs. And one of the aunties told me that there are even better Egyptian glyphs in Wilpenny a Pound in, I think, South Australia, and also near Mount Wilson in the Blue Mountains. It's a little bit too rugged for me to go looking for them. But and there was another man who told us he was working on building the freeway up to the Central Coast, and at Cowan they had to build a service road, and they found on the face of the cliff life-size carving of Horus, the Egyptian god Horus. He was holding a full-size man on one hand and woman on the other. They stopped work, and the next thing is the Australian Museum came out and they cut the entire rock face away, breaking a little bit of it. I had a friend who was a curator at the Australian Museum, and I said, do you know where this carving is? And she said, you have no idea what they've got in this basement that I don't know what's there. So it's been very much covered up. Now, Eric von Daniken came up to see them recently and said, as far as he was concerned, these glyphs were very, very old. He felt exactly the same thing. So I'm just leaving it as an update that in Gosford Files I thought they were fake. Now I've got my doubts. I found when I was studying the hieroglyphs, some researchers said, oh, the snake, it was a minor pharaoh's son and the snake bit him. But in actual, running snakes and snakes up high mean entirely different things in Egyptology. These are very ancient glyphs, so they don't always you can't always judge them by the Rosetta Stone translations. But it is thought that they actually came out here mining, and maybe these people got stranded here. I found other glyphs and things like that around which were interesting and unusual. I don't know the full story. Maybe we will never know. Actually, Zachariah Zitchin was interested in them, and I sent a copy of the video and pictures to him through a colleague, Rosemary Decker, in the United States. They went to Zitchin. He was also interested. I met a Russian Egyptologist who'd had a look at them. He also believed that they were genuine. So I don't know, but they were never meant to be found. They're hidden away so much. You could be walking in the escarpment above and not know they were there unless you came to the chasm where they are. The same from below. There's a huge big stone that you've got to climb through a hole to get to them, to actually get to these glyphs. This is the interesting part. You couldn't get a ladder up in that small space to carve the ones at the top. And also the other thing is, one of the people that was in my group, he's passed on now, he was in the army in Egypt for 2 years, and he pointed out something. There is a cartouche that actually designates one of the minor sons of one of those pharaohs. That minor son, his existence wasn't even discovered in Egypt until 1995. So how could it have been faked all those years earlier? It's one of those mysteries that remains, because it's only a matter of speculation and conjecture as to actually who did them and why. Now, this is just a photograph of a UFO that a fellow saw at Hammond, but it's a very interesting photo. I thought I'd just include it in for you to see. It's like a disc that's surrounded by white light. The next thing is, I want to speak a little bit about the Katoomba area where I live now. But there was a case in the 1950s where this was quite interesting, this gentleman was telling me about. On the Friday night, Gordon saw a bright red light glowing pink from his top of his restaurant in Katoomba Street. And then on Saturday, a whole lot of people disappeared down to the lookout at the Three Sisters, and they saw a few lights below. And then on the Sunday night, Gordon and a couple of friends saw this small light below Mount Solitary again, so they all trundled off down to the lookout with everybody else. And this light got bigger and bigger and bigger as it came closer. And it was a brilliant, luminous orange glow, perhaps similar to those Tom Price balls of light. and he said it whished by. And there was multiple witness reports of this huge big orange light going over Jamison Valley and over the lookout. And the next thing is the local radio announcer, John, got a visit from the RAAF. And they said that they tracked unidentified objects on radar. And they wanted to know him to ask on the radio for any other witnesses to come forward. But shortly afterwards, 3 men in black suits, 2 of whom didn't talk and one had an American accent, visited all the witnesses, and some of whom I've talked to that are pretty elderly now. They said they were from National Geographic magazine. Surprise, surprise. Now, what the witnesses said, they couldn't see any vehicle to go with these blokes. They said they didn't have any cameras, they didn't have any tape recorders, and they weren't taking notes. And so this was quite strange, all these visits from these strange men in with slick back black hair, just visiting all the witnesses. So that was the early 50s, so one wonders what was going on then. There's been a lot of stuff seen in the mountains. The one interesting one was a lady in about 1990. She worked in a restaurant where actually the kitchen was downstairs. The waitresses had to carry all the plates up the stairs to the restaurant, and there was a whole lot of families from the RAAF base at Glenbrook. And she stopped and looked and saw these 4 golden glowing balls of light coming out of the valley. And I had other witnesses that had told me about the same phenomena, that they'd also seen these golden balls of glowing light coming out of the valley. And she said the other waitresses stopped, and then she said one of the RAAF guys came down and said, well, what are you looking at? And he took one look, he raced up to the telephone, he made a telephone call. She said all the RAAF officers left the table, jumped in their cars, drove off to the base, leaving the wives with no cars and the bill to pay. Orange balls of light literally looking like they're going to collide with a cliff or headland and actually entering the cliff, just disappearing into a rocky face. And there was a case of an army bloke that told me in the 1980s, he was out at Lidsdale, which is down near Lithgow. I really don't know what they were doing. He wasn't going to say too much about what the army exercise was, but all of a sudden they saw this big red ball of flame and light coming towards them. He said it was about 8 metres in diameter. When it did go overhead, it was doing about 100 kilometres an hour and it was silent. He said he told all the guys to hit the ground. He thought, there's our vehicle gone, this thing's going to destroy our Jeep and everything else. He said they suddenly looked up and it literally entered the hill, and that's showing where it entered the hill. He said, so they thought, my God, what's this? So they went up, they spent 4 hours looking for traces of physical damage. There was no trace of that object, there was no trace of any burnt trees, any broken rocks, nothing, just everything gone. So they wrote it up in their notebooks and they went to see military intelligence at Holsworthy. All there was quite a bit of debriefing, he said, with security, he couldn't tell me, but all their notebooks and records were taken, and then they were told by military intelligence nothing happened. I'm going to talk a little bit about alien bases, which I've got in the alien gene, but this is very interesting because there is talk about alien bases in the Antarctica, which I will talk about afterwards. The thing is that DC-10 death flight, the crappy New Zealand passenger plane that went into Mount Erebus, I got called up by John Pinckney, who does a lot of UFO and paranormal reporting in Melbourne. He said he'd been contacted by a lot of ham radio operators who said that they were receiving messages from that plane that they were being buzzed by a UFO. And I said, they're not going to let you publish that. And he said, publish and be damned, and he did. But it was interesting because it did occur to me that perhaps they were on the wrong course and that UFO or whatever it was trying to warn them that they were on the wrong course. Because I unearthed a case from a gentleman called Keith Flitcroft, and he was flying over Normandy in 1942 during the war. And all of a sudden he was being buzzed by a green lighted UFO, and it buzzed him so much he literally had to elevate his height. When he got back to base in Britain, they said, geez, we saw you on radar, it was a good thing that you elevated, you were about to crash into a mountain. So that UFO was actually trying to force him to go up. It meant, well, maybe the same thing happened at Mount Erebus, we'll never know, because the authorities are not going to admit, ever, that there was these things about it being, that craft being buzzed by a UFO. But it was obviously on the wrong course. So maybe it was trying to warn them, I don't know. In Alien Gene, I'm talking about the interaction with human visitors who look like us and we look like them, or vice versa. Their communication with normal people, plus many scientists, telepathic and spoken. Many of these scientists and people have disclosed what happened in later years when they're elderly and they think, well, what can the authorities do to me now? A lot of researchers researching this have actually met with early deaths. But then I have documented presidents, ministers and officials, military officers, all admitting to the same thing, that there has been contact. But the message that these aliens have been given in the 1950s, and I talk a lot about them, including George Adamski, Dan Fry, people I knew that actually knew them and were present at the time, their message was the same. We have to stop wars, especially nuclear blasts, and we have to care for this planet. We are destroying ourselves on the planet. But nobody would listen to the messages. And then they said, we have to peacefully coexist or we will destroy ourselves. And they said other civilizations have been here before us that have actually done this. They have actually destroyed themselves, that we're not the first civilization. And I've looked at a lot of the sightings and the contacts prior to the 1960s. Now I think by the time the 1960s came, we were more able to detect their craft. Much more able, we were more advanced. So therefore, they quietly integrated in with our society or went sort of off planet, you know. They maybe were in other parts of the solar system. Because the thing is, but during World War II, there was a lot of the Foo Fighters, which a lot of people have attested to seeing the Foo Fighters during the war. They weren't ours and they weren't the Germans. And there was much larger craft which could not have been our own. Although some of the scientists or major corporation heads have admitted some stuff's been our own technology, some was reversed engineer. And there are some secret facilities and experiments as well. And I've talked about one in an island off New Zealand in the 1970s. There was an experiment going on there, government-sponsored, contacting aliens. And it was on an island, and actually the inhabitants of the island were having just as much contact. Now, the people I dealt with, I have spoken to one of the scientists that managed that project, so I've got confirmation. The one family, I've known granny, mum and dad, daughter, grandson, and also a couple of their friends that were all on this island and had all these experiences with this alien technology, abduction, messages, all kinds of stuff like that. Quite a lot of the cases in Alien Gene and also in Contact Downunder have had strange men following or interacting with people. Nice, some of them are very good looking blonde-haired people, some look a little bit scruffy but look just like us, and they can suddenly just disappear into thin air, just disappear. I'm wondering, and this is just my own theory, a lot of the witnesses said they've got this funny little black box on their belt, and I wonder if it's something like Harry Potter's cloak of invisibility. There is, it has been explained by scientists, and I can't really go into it, but there is a way of putting like a shield around yourself that reflects back so they can't actually see you underneath it, and some of the new stealth aircraft work under that principle as well. But there's quite a lot of these. Now, in Dan Fry and George Adamski cases, I know people who were there that knew them. They actually helped the aliens assume false identities. That's why I had to wait until several people had died before I could write this book, because they could have been in quite a bit of trouble. They were getting them false passports, false birth certificates, especially in the days before computers, when it could be more easily done without being checked. And there was an interesting case in 1932 in France, and this hospital in Amiens, this English woman who was called Mrs. Smith was brought into the hospital, and she'd been in a car crash. But when the doctor did a blood test, he suddenly realised her blood was a rather funny colour and it wasn't human. So he thought, oh my God. So what he did, he got the hospital to put her in a single room that had bars on the window with a guard outside. He called the police the next morning, and guess what? She was gone from the room, and so was her car. And there was another case in 1954 in Japan, where this bloke turned up at the airport, and he had this passport. It had 2 previous Japanese entry stamps in it, but the immigration bloke was a little bit more careful. He said, I've never heard of this country. Now, the bloke purported to be French. He spoke fluent French, but also Japanese. And they said, this country doesn't exist. And he said, yes, it does. There it is. And he pointed to Andorra. But they said, that's not the name on your passport. And he said, oh, yes, 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 I am. So then they checked his checkbook, but his checkbook was made out to a bank that didn't exist. So then they rang the company who he said he was visiting, and they hadn't heard of him. They rang the hotel he was supposed to be booked into, and they hadn't heard of him either. So they thought, right, they locked him up in immigration security overnight. The next morning, he was gone. Not only that, all his documents out of the security safe had gone as well. So you've got case after case of very interesting cases of the integration. Dan Fry admitted to helping them integrate and actually getting the false passports and the false IDs for them, but he didn't do them himself. He actually got them from somebody in the know on the inside in the sheriff's office, because you've got your local sheriff's offices all around the state. He was getting their false IDs from there. And about 1960, they told these contactees, a lot of them were leaving, but a lot were staying on Earth. They were wanting us to accept New Age type technology, in other words, safer technology. But apparently their efforts were refuted. And I have said in the book, and this is just my theory, I don't normally have theories, I thought maybe the aliens had a plan, several plans. They obviously did not want to let us loose in the galaxy the way we are. And if you look at the world today, we are not a very nice race of people. We kill enough of our own, and, you know, we're very warlike. I did speculate on something, and I don't speculate or theorise very much. Some of those aliens are told people they came from Mars or Venus, which of course got people totally ridiculed. But then I thought, you know, look, some of the major superpowers around the world have military bases in other countries. What if on our solar system there are several self-sustaining military bases of aliens? In other words, they're just an outpost. They do not want to let us loose up there. So maybe they had a plan. Maybe if you look at the Nazis in World War II, which I've discussed, perhaps they thought they'd maybe be able to get one single world power that would contain us and would you know, toe the line. And that certainly didn't work. Now we've got China, Russia, America, ISIS. We've got competing powers. The United Nations is not so powerful anymore, and the League of Nations totally failed. So I thought, well, maybe plan B was to visit us and say, look, we're nice neighbours from the galaxy. We want to help you. We want you to be all nice and well behaved. And certainly nobody listened to those messages. So then I thought maybe plan C was to genetically manipulate enough of us that we've become more spiritual. We've become nicer. And I often wonder about Woodstock. Woodstock happened in the 60s, when a lot of this genetic engineering had sort of begun round about the latest round about World War II, because I honestly think there's been a lot of genetic manipulation way in the past as well. And I thought to myself, well, if a lot of people were genetically manipulated with Woodstock and love, sex and rock and roll, there was probably half a new generation fathered at those different festivals, that's for sure. I thought, well, maybe plan D, the last thing, is to just microchip the lot of us and maybe then just be able to control us. And that's not so funny as it sounds, because they've persuaded us to microchip our pets. You've got people working for corporations that are microchipping their employees because it makes it simpler. If in Star Trek, and Jeannie Roddenberry was no fool, if in Star Trek that prime directive thing was correct, they're not supposed to interfere with another planet, what better than to get us all to microchip each other? And do you honestly think any alien race would give us all their technology? And there's a danger, because if we all got microchipped like good little sausages and did as we were told, what's to stop an alien race taking over the technology totally? Taking over what we've set up ourselves. It's a thought. And I think sometimes you have to think outside of the box, because I don't know the answers, I just know the questions. But so I have talked about that. I've talked about a lot of the integration and the sightings from before World War I, a lot of the abductions and what the abductees were told right through to World War II and later. I've gone into what a lot of military people, heads of state, are all saying. It's interesting that according to the internet, Robert Bigelow has now come out and said that there are aliens among us. That really rocked me that he would say that, if that's true. But yes, it's becoming more and more interesting about what exactly has been going on and what is being kept from us.
Who's Robert Bigelow?
Robert Bigelow is a multi-billionaire now. He was, he did have a chain of cheap motels throughout America, but then all of a sudden he went right into aerospace. He paid MUFON a lot of money for their records. He's always had an interest in UFOs. But now he's into his 70s, perhaps he's coming out with stuff. I don't know what the agenda is at all. I really don't know. But he's had a lot to do with NASA, a lot to do with space travel and innovation and the corporations that are making it possible, because when NASA was formed, it was merely a government body. And they contracted out to big companies all the hardware, software, everything else that made it possible for us to go into space. The government didn't produce it themselves. They subcontracted to these big contractors to make it all possible. And he actually has a thing called Bigelow Aerospace and some very, very innovative ideas for going out into space. Also, when I was talking about the integration, in 1960s in Italy, there was a group called the Amicizia, and they were liaising with aliens and helping them. And also I found there were similar groups in Germany, Austria and Switzerland. And I knew this, I still know her, a very senior registered nurse from Siberia. And she goes back to Siberia every couple of years, northern Siberia. And she talks about a similar group there, that they're having interaction with aliens and helping them. And some of her relatives are still seeing UFOs. Now, she is one of these straight-laced matronly type nurses. She doesn't fantasise, no nonsense whatsoever. So that quite interested me, that side of the interaction before. Now, when I was talking about the families, I've known most of these 3 to 4 generations for similar years, but I suddenly realised after years of knowing them, they had a pattern or a similar background. They had a lot in common. A lot were of European descent. And then I found that they had a similar bloodline as well. Their ancestors were military. The women and the daughters had this medical evidence of them being interfered with. Either their ovaries have been damaged or totally taken. They've got implants. The children now talk about playing with the little ones or playing with Peter Pan. This is very interesting that kids today that have never heard of Peter Pan are suddenly all telling me that they've been playing with Peter Pan or he's taking them for a ride in his train. And these are 2- and 3-year-olds. Now what I've noticed with a lot of these contact cases, the visitors seem to be a little bit out of touch. They wear clothing which is out of date or not right for the particular season, or they're going back to things like Peter Pan which are totally past history. You know, a child about 40 years ago might have heard about Peter Pan, but not today. But these kind of things are happening. A lot of these contactees in these families have had secret visits to school. I won't say by men in black, but they were told they were men from the ministry, visiting them at school, asking them questions, testing their abilities, and yet the parents didn't know about it. The parents were not told. Also of Mensa. I wonder about the organisation Mensa, because they've got a Mensa for children. And guess what? There's a psychic group attached to it as well. Now, a lot of these people that have had this contact or been subject to genetic manipulation actually have various abilities. Some are psychic, some are kinetic, some have healing abilities. It varies. And they're very telepathic with each other. And they can be on different sides of the world but do exactly the same thing at the same time. A lot of them have been warned about a possible natural cataclysm on Earth. They all have got away from the ocean and got up high. They've all done strange things. I found out about 4 of them last year in the same week went out and bought an airbed that they didn't even need. They talk about control of their thoughts or compulsions, things like that. And then I thought, how can these people be thinking the same thing or doing the same thing at the same time? Is it something to do with the genetic connection? Have they got similar genes? Now, when I looked into genetic research, 95% of our genes that they call junk DNA aren't at all, but we don't know what they do. And then I thought of a classic case. I thought, hang on, identical twins. You could have one twin in London and one twin in Sydney. And if something happens to the one, the other knows immediately. So I'm thinking, is it in the genes? Is it in molecular memory? And then I started to try and do in that book a little bit of research into the genetics. But we know very little about it, really. But I think I've only touched the tip of the iceberg. I think it's just not these families. I think there could be thousands of families around that have been subject to the same experiences without knowing it or without talking about it. But the thing is, I then looked into genetic research. I then realised with the brain, there is so much of the brain we do not understand how it works, why it works. And then this is another thing. Some of them have talked about being taken, I'm not going to say where it is, but they've been taken to the same place by aliens and told that that's a place of refuge for later. And yet they're describing the same place. And they don't know each other. Very few of these witnesses or families actually know each other. One comes from New Zealand, one's down the south coast, one's up the Blue Mountains, some are in Britain, some have come from Italy or places like that. It's just that by researching these families over a long period, because this was something genetic that was affecting, you know, Granny would be talking about flying carpets or flying saucers, and then Mum and Dad would talk about it, and it turned out that the daughter or the granddaughter was having similar things. But I mean, there was actual physical evidence in the way of implants, in the way of damage to their reproductive systems. And this is what really got me intrigued. The whole book's not necessarily about that, but some of the cases take up to 20 pages in the book because it's taken a long time to research it. But when you know a family for 30 years or 20 years, you begin to know they're not all fantasising, or if they're all loopy, you soon would realise that. No, these are people that I've had to keep their identities totally secret. totally secret. Some of them have asked me to write their story for them. I mean, the one woman, her husband's a military officer. She can hardly start writing about what had happened to her. It would cause him a great deal of problems. There's quite a few other interesting ones. Yeah, now I had a funny one though. The girl that's in Contact Downunder, Katie Cook. But this is just part of what happened. But in 1966, her father, they lived on a property, and Dad had what I suspect were 2 stills at the back of his tea tree plantation. He was making himself some nice lot of hooch and probably selling it in the country. Father disappeared for 3 weeks once, and he thought he was only gone a week, as what had happened with another family. But one day he saw the flying saucer over his stills, and he jumped in his old Volkswagen and he's chasing this craft up the dirt track, yelling and shouting. And I thought, oh, I've heard about aliens taking water but not pinching the grog. And the thought of drunken aliens, I thought, oh yes. There was another one that was rather strange. It was in the United States in 1961. These 4 hunters were coming back on a cold, sleety night from hunting, and this fiery object came down near the road. They thought it was a plane crash. They could see the shape of some object, and it had come down fiery. They saw a couple of figures near it. So they raced back to town, and they told the sheriff, there's been a plane crash, you better come out. So the sheriff comes out 20 minutes and there's nothing there. So they felt a bit sheepish, and they thought, we know what we saw. Later on, going down the road, they saw a landed craft, like a flying saucer. And there was 2 men, about 5.5 foot tall, with like coveralls on. So they thought, right, we're going to get our proof. We're going to get one of these aliens and prove to the sheriff that we saw what we saw. So 2 of the hunters turned on the spotlight, and the other 2 circled round, and they fired a shot. And it got one of the blokes in the shoulder. And the next thing is the other bloke ran out and yelled out in pure English, what the hell did you do that for? So he carried his mate back to this craft, and they took off absolutely terrified. And they said, we'll never mention it. We've probably shot an Air Force officer with some kind of prototype. And the next day, the one bloke's at work, the one that had fired the shot, and 2 men arrived at work, accompanied him home, examined his muddy shoes, and then said nothing else. But I thought, oh my God, they shot an Air Force officer. And when they were asked, but didn't you think it was wrong to shoot the fellow? Oh, we thought it was an alien. It was all right to shoot him and bring him back as evidence. So you've got some funny cases too. But I mean, I've only touched the tip of the iceberg with what I've researched. But there was an interesting one that came from 1963 in Roma, in Queensland, so it's one of your own. This lady was only 12, and she rang me in 1999 because she was worried about her daughter. And the daughter was starting to have experiences, and Penny herself had seen lights outside and, you know, seen evidence of it. When she was 12, Penny's father was an itinerant worker, and they were going to Roma to do a job, but his car broke down, and he had to wait for 3 weeks to get the money to fix the car to keep going. So they camped at the side of the railway line, and all of a sudden, 2 oval objects, each the size of a small bus, with white searchlights in the front, came over. And her father, strangely enough, was saying, they found us. She hid under a bush, but under hypnotherapy, she remembered what happened. The next thing she'd remembered was being at a dead campfire hours later, and the father telling her and her brother to go to bed. But under hypnosis, she was dragged out by a blue light and taken on this craft. Now, afterwards, her brother had nightmares. They were both scared to sleep in the dark. But she said there was little people. There was little people there, and they gave her visions of us evil humans destroying ourselves and our planet. Then she was given the most horrible examination and one of her ovaries was taken. Now the little lady said that you're ours, and we haven't seen you since you were a small baby. Now in Alien Gene I also discussed a part, I called it Grow Your Own Humans. And I'm treading on theoretical but not theoretical. One friend told me in 1960s she was going through university and they were doing an experiment in a laboratory underground and they grew a test tube baby. She said, but it was horrible. It came out all wrong. It could drink and it could poo, but it was just a blob. And they didn't know what to do with it. She said because if they killed it, that was murder, but they couldn't let it keep living. I asked her what happened. She said she fled the scene. She doesn't know. And then it occurred to me that these particular aliens in Penny's case were smaller, not so much like us. And I thought, they're taking men's sperm. We hear of cases that men had their sperm taken. That's relatively easy, and most of the victims come back with a big grin from ear to ear. But with the women, it's different. You can't get those over quite so easily. But they are taking them. And I thought, they've got the male sperm, they've got the female ova. If they're more advanced than us, they surely could grow their own test tube babies. Now the whole thing is, could they actually, with our sperm and ova, create humans, bring them up on the craft, brainwash them, put them back on Earth? We don't know. We really don't know. That's one possibility. The other thing is, when this little lady said, you're ours, we haven't seen you since you were a small baby. How did her father know they found us? The whole thing left a lot of unanswered questions. And also in Britain at the end of the war, when quite a bit of, I've talked about the genetic experimentation going on then, a lot of the orphanages and churches found babies just left on the doorstep and they could never trace where those babies came from, whose babies they were or anything. Now I happen to know, I've got one witness who's a friend of mine that was one of those babies. She is incredibly intelligent, really gifted, as a lot of these products of this genetic manipulation are. They've all got incredible gifts. She's actually in Australia incognito because there's something she's scared of that she won't go back. But she doesn't know who her parents were or where she came from. And a lot of these women, these so-called products of that, look very similar. Very similar in looks. So it's something that I don't know the answer to, but it is quite fascinating. The one subject I've got in Contact Downunder, and it'll wake you all up, that's alien sex. It happens. Now, especially with the ones that look like us, I'm talking the ones that look like us and we look like them. Now, we've got somebody here that actually knew her. There was the case of Elizabeth Clara in South Africa, who had a relationship with a man she loved very much. She ended up going back to his planet but couldn't live there. And I've had other cases of humanoid visitors that look like us saying they can only live on our Earth for so long because it's slightly different with the atmosphere, the gravity, that kind of stuff. She could only live on his planet for so long. She bore him a son, but she left the son back on his planet and came back to Earth. And there's quite a lot of evidence that Elizabeth Clara was definitely telling the truth. Some people tried to ridicule her. She was a very refined woman. The people that knew her said she was highly intelligent. She was educated at Oxford University. She went back to South Africa. She worked for the Air Force during the war, and the Air Force used to actually help her go and meet him. But it was, and that can be attested too. We have got other cases where it wasn't consensual sex, where some women are claimed to be raped. There was one girl who claimed to be raped, and he said he was really good looking, but he came out of the saucer, kidnapped her, raped her, and the only proof she had was a scar on her leg where she caught it on something escaping from the spacecraft, and her subsequent pregnancy. But what about we get these cases, and this is serious because I have to do with these families, What about the cases where the women have either been involved sexually with the aliens, or they've had their ova taken, and all that kind of stuff? It has severe effects on the victims and their families. And it is just as wrong if it's done by an alien race as if it was done by one of our own people. It's still wrong. They feel shame. They feel an aversion to sex. The husband feels angry and betrayed. And a lot of these marriages break down because of the contact, because of what happened. Because it has such a psychological effect on both husband and wife. Quite often where couples are abducted, the husband or the partner gets very, very depressed. Very depressed. Or they can be hostile and have a personality change. Now, what I've pointed out is that, in actual fact, if we talk as adults, the sexual urge begins in the brain. Any woman can tell you that. You want to attract a man, you dress up, you wear perfume, but you are appealing to his brain. And his brain likes what he sees and he starts to feel sexy. So if these aliens are controlling the brains of these people, because we've got lots of cases where the women have had a sudden compulsion towards a man. And I'm not joking, sometimes it has produced a child, and once that happened, there's no more interest. Dr. Carla Turner, who died young, she talked about 4 of her contactees she was working with all had a compulsive sexual attraction to a particular entertainer they didn't even know. And as I said in the book, I had to have a little giggle about the thought of this entertainer that had no idea that there was at least 4 women all fantasising over him. But it is the fact that they're controlling people's brain. It's mind control. And mind control is really the basis of a lot of things. We talk about people that have the implants and that. They talk about putting them in soldiers to make them more aggressive and fearless. So a lot of stuff goes back to what's happening in our mind. And I don't really know the answers to all of this. But I just know all the questions. And as I research more, there's more and more questions come out as I discover similarities between the different cases. And sometimes it takes a long time before you think, hey, hang on. And a lot of these witnesses and the families I talk about had a similar bloodline, a similar ancestry. The father or grandfather was also doing a similar thing at a similar time. So it just brings up the question, what actually is happening and why? Who is manipulating people's minds? Is it our own Earth people? Is it aliens? Is it a joint project between the two? We don't know, and I don't know. But something is definitely going on. But getting to the bottom of it is difficult. I don't think I'll know in my lifetime. I'll just keep adding all the facts up.